This is Focal Point with Brian Fisher on AFR Talk.
Hi, and welcome back to Focal Point on AFR Talk. This is Focal Point, the home of muscular Christianity on conservative talk radio. You know, we've been following this story about the disappearance of this Malaysian airliner leaving from Malaysia, destination Beijing, completely disappeared, just fell off the map, and people really do not know what happened. Now there's some stories I've been reading that maybe that airplane, which headed toward the east, headed toward China, kind of to the northeast, somehow or other turned directions and started going to the west and wound up over the Strait of Malacca, which is on the west side of Malaysia, the opposite direction. So people really have no idea what is going on. We talked with you yesterday about the fact that we know that there were two men on that plane that used false passports. They used stolen passports, not their own passports. We read today they got into the country, into Malaysia, on their own passports. They used their own passports to get into the country, but they got on the plane using false passports, both from the country of Iran. Their tickets purchased at the same time by an Iranian businessman. So people are asking the question, is there a possible terrorist angle to this thing? The director of the CIA, John Brennan, saying we haven't ruled anything out. We're not saying it is. We're not saying it's not. And here to help us sort through some of this is John Guandolo. John is a former FBI agent. He was one of the leading counter-terrorism experts in the federal government working for the FBI. He is the founder of the website understandingthethreat.com, co-author of the book Sharia, The Threat to America, and author of a soon-to-be-released book, Raising a Jihadi Generation, Handbook for Law Enforcement and Intelligence Professionals. John, welcome back to Focal Point with Brian Fisher.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
You bet, John. And what you're a counterterrorism expert. That's what you did for the FBI. You still do consulting work on that. In fact, I read a story about you doing some training for Virginia law enforcement over the threat represented to the United States by Islam. So you're still very active monitoring these developments. What do you think? Do you think that there is a terrorist angle to the disappearance of this Malaysian Airlines airplane?
I will say this. We still don't know enough to make a definitive comment, but I will say definitively there's some pretty big red flags. The fact that these two passports were stolen, that we have information that these are potentially Iranians there. Were they just trying to travel? Is it a coincidence that they were trying to travel without anybody tracking them because they were working a mission, an operation? Or was this they were looking to take the plane down? Seems to me if they traveled into the country, the question is maybe they knew that their names would raise questions flying into China. China monitors certain individuals a lot differently than we do.
Well, you know, and John, that was a question I had. I'd like your comment on this. You know, I'm reading today, this is a piece on newsmax.com indicating that they came into the country of Malaysia using their own passports. This is according to the Interpol Secretary General Ronald Noble, Iranians aged 18 to 29 who entered Malaysia using their real passports before using the stolen European documents to board the Beijing-bound flight. So that's my question. I mean, that's a big red flag to me. Why would they use their real passports to get into the country and then use fake passports to get on the plane? What would be the possibilities there?
Well, the one reason that would support either option, like if they were trying to travel into China under passports that they know the Chinese aren't going to give necessarily the same kind of look they would as for guys coming from Iran. So that's the first thing. If they were trying to get into China for a purpose, for an operational purpose, whether it's counterintelligence or whether it's just criminal activity, or they just want to get into China for who knows what, fugitives from the law, but that doesn't seem to be the case. So you've got those angles. The other thing is, if they traveled in their true name, I think once more is known about these guys, if in fact, and again, that may not be known, because if the information is of a counterintelligence realm, then we may not know, and then they just went down on a plane crash. Several things seem odd. The fact that passports were stolen, the fact that these are two Iranians, and that this whole thing was arranged by, according to at least one source, by one single Iranian businessman,
Mm-hmm.
and then the fact that the plane took a significant change of course with no communications that we're aware of. And according to the different towers at the last known contact with them, which were hours prior to what they believe the likely crash time is, they were completely off. It's almost as if someone shut the radio down. And we don't have evidence that they were tracking them at all. So that is all evidence that something was very awry, or there was literally a spontaneous catastrophic failure of the aircraft, which is the thing exploded in midair and it just went dead silent. That's a much less likely scenario, but it is possible.
And I have a question about this transponder, and I know you're not an aviation expert, and neither am I, but according to this Newsmax piece, the transponder had been turned off. Now, the transponder makes the aircraft visible to secondary radar. That would be civil controllers, like at airports. Secondary radar interrogates the transponder and gets information about the plane's identity, speed, and height. But the transponder was turned off so that it couldn't be tracked. It could only be tracked by military. So, I mean, I don't know if you know how you get a transponder turned off, who would do it, how easy it is to do that. Do you know anything about that?
I don't know the details of the aircraft. I know that it's possible, and obviously if somebody who knows what they're doing, it makes you wonder, is one of the pilots involved? Did they storm who knows? And then again, the other thing is complete catastrophic failure of the aircraft is an option at this point. But there are some pretty big red flags. And I think you're hitting on one with regard to these guys who used a different passport to get on the airplane. Again, the first two things I think of is they did not want scrutiny from the government into which they're flying, because, of course, they screen all the arriving passengers. So, I would lean towards there was something else going on, but it's certainly, they may have thought that coming into the country was different. They didn't want to get flagged at the airport. In other words, if they thought that when they came into the country red flags went up, then they wanted to be able to get on the airplane and do an operation, i.e. destroy the airplane, crash it into the sea, that kind of thing. That may have been the reason, too.
Well, and there's another dimension to this I haven't heard anybody talk about, because what people are saying, well, these guys are not suspicious because they were just seeking asylum in Europe. Their destination was Germany or Amsterdam or whatever, and they had tickets to go all the way from Malaysia. They were going to land in China, but then their ultimate destination was Europe. And the thing that I found confusing about that, John, or at least raise questions in my mind, it doesn't seem to me that's the most direct way to get to Western Europe. Why would you go through China to get to Amsterdam? I mean, you got to go into Malaysia, first of all. Why would you even go into Malaysia if you're going to fly away from Europe to China and then get on a plane in China and go? It seems like there are much more direct ways to get to Europe if your agenda really is seeking asylum in Europe. Do you have any comment on that?
Well, the two things that pop to mind is operationally, when they stole the passports, they weren't randomly stealing passports. In other words, they stole them in European cities in where they were. Now, the U.S. government's saying it was stolen in Thailand versus Malaysia, so that's fine. So that means the people stealing them were paid to steal specifically European passports, and were probably given a range of countries. So it looks like they're getting on the plane. The final destination for them is Europe, so it makes sense. So if they were to get off the plane in China for some other reason, then of course you've got those issues right there. I don't know. I think, again, my radar is up for both a counterintelligence operation as well as a potential operation on the plane. But again, the catastrophic failure of the aircraft is still on the table. One thing I do want to say before we get off that I do think is worthwhile at least laying out is this is the first time in recent memory that the U.S. government hasn't immediately ruled out terrorism.
Mm-hmm.
And I find that interesting because in the Fort Hood shooter, we said, that was workplace violence. And the FBI, before the FBI even got to Fort Hood, said it was not terrorism. The Little Rock, Arkansas shooter, that's not terrorism, even though he, Allahu Akbar killed a soldier, and he said what I just did was jihad. We say that's not quote unquote terrorism, and on and on. We can go through all these examples where the government is saying it's not terrorism. It's nice that they didn't just fall backwards and say that again this time. So that tells me maybe there's something here that they didn't immediately. And maybe if it were an American Muslim, they would immediately have said it was not terrorism. But
and it seemed to me, John, and again, that may be a perfectly innocent explanation. I think you and I probably both agree the spontaneous explosion or implosion of this plane in mid-flight due to just accident is probably the most remote of all the possibilities. Every other explanation would have something sinister connected with it in some way, obviously. But I was struck by the fact that the authorities told us early on that they knew the nationality of the two passengers that were flying under stolen passports, but they weren't going to tell us what it was. And that kind of raised a red flag in my mind. There's got to be some reason why they don't want us to know the ethnic nationality of these passengers. And it turns out they were Iranian, which obviously raises the questions about links to possible Islamic terrorism. All right, John, we'll obviously give you 30 seconds to wrap up. But obviously, we don't have enough to have a definitive. Where do you think this thing is going?
Well, I think in the future, there's a good chance if we find a potential crash site because of the depth of the ocean, there's a chance we'll find the black box that may answer some questions, and I suspect that will be a key. Until then, I think the Iranians are the key, and my guess is there's some American counterintelligence agents working this to find out, because I guess there's a lot more information that's not being put out right now that we probably already know about this.
Our guest, John Guandolo, former counterterrorism expert for the FBI. Thanks, John, for taking time to be with us.
Thank you.